Talked with a couple friends recently who have suffered offense or hurt or pain or broken relationships. Really, they've had their feelings hurt in some way or another by friends, and they were kind of struggling to forgive. Really, in the last week or two, 3 or 4 people I've talked with who have had these kind of breaking points in relationships that have made it really hard to kind of move on. And it's left them struggling to be in a state of peace about it, but finding it to be a hard thing to do. And it's left me wondering, what's the trick to this? What's the trick to moving on with some peace? And then as I kind of like expanded in my mind what it looks like for people to be suffering in the pain of broken relationships, I realized that that's kind of what we're all up to these days in one way or another. There's been some good, honest assessment people have made of themselves, being able to say, I'm a sinner who breaks relationships. And I think I've contributed to some of that in my life and in the lives of people in my neighborhoods and in my community. Others are aware, very aware that people have offended them, but they're not really, they haven't been blessed with the peace that might come from forgiveness. And so there's just kind of all these ideas swirling around in my head. I'm just wondering, what's the thing to think about it today? What does Jesus have to say about this? And I happened to be listening to a sermon by one of my favorite preachers, a guy named Tim Keller. And he was talking about forgiveness, and he was asking the question, why did Jesus have to die? Why is it that Jesus died in order for us to be forgiven? Now, he says that when the answer comes in really kind of assessing what it's like to be truly hurt or offended or to have a relationship broken in front of you. And what he ends up kind of believing is that all forgiveness is a form of voluntary suffering. Say that more clearly. Every bit of forgiveness, anyone's forgiveness, is a form of voluntary suffering. It is choosing to suffer. And here's how he breaks it down. He says, when you are hurt, when you are suffering, when you are just in pain from this broken relationship, you know that you've got a couple options, really just two. The first is that the person who has offended you, you can make them pay. And you can make them pay in one way or another. Maybe you can make them pay actually by bringing retributive justice against them and making them actually literally, physically, or financially pay, something to try to make it right, And in that, you often are going to be met within yourself with a hardened heart, with an anger that is never quite satisfied or relieved, with more questions when it's all over. All this making them pay is over than when you even began. But you can do that. You can make them pay. And even if you can't make them pay literally or physically, in your own thoughts and heart, you make them pay daily by knowing that they're the one who has brought all this pain upon you. They're the one who has caused you all of your problems. They're the one who is keeping you back in life. That's that's one option, making them pay. But the other option is you can forgive them. And that sounds really simple, but what Keller says is it's not simple because of what it requires. To forgive them, to not make them pay, means that you need to avoid actions that would make them pay. You need to avoid words that would make them pay. You need to avoid even thoughts that would make them pay. And that's the life of the thoughts about how they're the one who should be responsible for the pain you're feeling. And the thing is, he says, is that when you choose the option to make them pay, very often it spreads animosity and hate, because you end up with a hardened heart and you're never quite satisfied with the payment that they've given, and there's no form of peace to move on. And indeed, a relationship is almost never repaired when the option to make them pay is the one we pursue. On the other hand, in forgiveness, peace comes easily. Peace comes quickly. Peace comes even if, for the forgiver, even if the forgivee, the one who's done the hurt, doesn't quite accept it or understand it. And so that's kind of, that's where the suffering comes in, though. Because rather than making them pay and taking that kind of easy route, we have to make that choice to be the one who doesn't make them pay, but instead finds a different way out. And so this is how forgiveness works, is what Keller says. So then when you look to Jesus, and you see what he did. You see what he did on the cross. You can see that if God was given the option, if we feel these pains of justice and of the need for justice so deeply within our hearts when we've been wronged. Imagine how the God who made the universe, the God who set up the systems of right and wrong that we operate within, imagine if the God who has given us everything we have, imagine how strongly he feels these pains of right and wrong then. And then how much more then would those two options be also his, to either make us pay for that which we've done or to forgive. And of course, that's the route that God took in Christ Jesus. He doesn't make us pay. Instead, he is the one who takes on this form of voluntary suffering in forgiving us. This is really simply stated in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I just want to read these couple verses for you, starting at 17. Paul writes here, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. It's our job now to take upon ourselves this message of reconciliation, indeed this ministry of reconciliation, to turn to those who have hurt us, to turn to those who have offended us, to turn to those who have who would even make us pay, and to forgive, and to reap the benefits of the peace that comes from that. So if you're a person who's been suffering with some pain that someone's brought upon you, I'm so sorry. Know that in Christ Jesus, the world has been reconciled back to God himself, and that there can be peace. And that indeed you can have that peace even more so in your forgiving of those who have hurt you. God's peace be with you, church. I pray that you are well and that you will join us in this message and this ministry of reconciliation.